All right, welcome everyone to the October 2013 installment of the Nonprofit Insights webinar series hosted by VolunteerMatch. My name is Shari Ilson and I produce and host these webinars each month. Today we have a very special session to look forward to, all about the overhead myth. What it is, why it matters, and what now. And we're joined by some really distinguished members of the nonprofit sector who are going to take us through what this issue really means and what we can all do to help solve it. Before we get started, just a few logistics. First of all, we will be sending everyone on this call a copy of the full webinar recording and the slide deck. So don't worry about taking serious notes, and don't worry if you miss something because you can go back and reference it later. Also, if you have a question for the speakers, we'll be moderating those and asking them at the end of the session. You can input those questions in that chat box at the bottom of your screen. Also, please join our Twitter conversation, and you can ask questions there as well using hashtag #VMLearn. I believe that's it. So I'm going to hand things over to VolunteerMatch's President, Greg Baldwin.
Thank you, and welcome everybody to the webinar. We're really excited today because we've got two very, very special guests and friends of VolunteerMatch to talk with you about the overhead myth. I think many of you will know the organizations, and you may have met these folks along the way. We have Jacob Harold, who's the President and CEO of GuideStar. That's a fairly new position for Jacob. He's been there for probably about a year now, and he's formerly from the Hewlett Foundation, and a long, long time ago with the Bridgespan Group. And we also have with us Goggins Gregory, who's the Senior Director of Knowledge at the Bridgespan Group. She is a long-time advocate for the nonprofit space, and one of the important reference points to this conversation, and co-wrote in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, the Nonprofit Starvation Cycle. These are two experts and two people that are doing a great deal to push this conversation ahead and help the sector get past what has been, in many people's view, an unhealthy state of affairs, squeezing our overhead ratios to look a little bit better than perhaps is healthy for the typical organization. So we've got a full schedule, and I want to start by turning it over to Anne, who has a presentation that kind of set the stage for this conversation, and then she'll pass it over to Jacob with some ideas about how we can push ahead and change the conversation, and then we'll do some Q&A at the end. If you do have questions along the way, though, please feel free to send them, as Sherry has mentioned, and if there are things that are relevant, we will interrupt and ask some questions as things go along. So let's get rolling. So Anne, do you have the helm?
I believe I have the helm. People should see the overhead myth landing page with Bridgespan up the upper left. So it's great to be here today. First of all, thank you for having me. My role on today's call, at least in this first part, is to really set some context about the overhead myth, or what we've called the nonprofit starvation cycle. They're both very sinister names, frankly, by design, to connote the need to move from something pretty unproductive and vicious to something productive and virtuous. My understanding is that we have both nonprofit leaders as well as funders, institutional and individual, on the call today. So my hope is to address what anyone interested in social change can do to better fund that change. And yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I just remembered that we actually have a poll that we can administer real quick.
Oh, that would be great.
Find out who is actually on the call. So
that'd be great.
Everyone is seeing it now. We'll leave it open for about 30 seconds, and then we'll show the responses, and we can get a look at what the makeup of our audience is.
Great.
So the results are coming in. Nonprofits have an early lead. They're surging to the front, 83%. We have a few funders in the room, a few for-profits, a smattering of unaffiliated, but it looks like things are settling out, and it looks about 80% of the audience is nonprofit, 7-ish% funders, and 5% for-profit companies, and the rest are unaffiliated. Decline to affiliate. So primarily nonprofits.
Okay, good. So I'm going to actually start with, if for folks that are interested in creating social change and how to fund the social change, what we're going to talk about today is the role that anybody on this call can play to move to something more virtuous. But let's start with maybe what not to do. So here you'll see quotes from various promotion materials from nonprofits. No administrative fees means all the money goes to local charities. We remain lean. Nearly 90% of the revenue goes to direct service programs, etc. I suspect we've all seen these, or the pie chart with the very, very skinny, look how lean we are portion that shows fundraising and admin and general expense. Probably there are a lot of reasons, actually, why there are incentives to behave this way, and some of it does get back to unrealistic funder behavior. But the fact is that nonprofits that are communicating about what they do and the value they bring probably aren't doing themselves a lot of favors by starting with these sorts of messages. Behind the scenes, you hear a slightly different and more nuanced perspective from EDs saying things like the 10% overhead figure is unrealistic, or from board chairs. In the course of our research, talked to a lot of board members who talked about the need to raise pools of unrestricted dollars to pay for real overhead costs. So the fact is that those quotes on the earlier slide, it's possible to make them very, very honestly. This is not about being disingenuous or dishonest. Organizations like human resource as a function. It means having systems and processes and infrastructure that powers finance, HR, operations. And when we talk about what the different people on this bus do, we're also talking about the percentages of staff time to do work outside of the organization's core programs. So for instance, the portion of the executive director's time required to do fundraising to raise money to support the organization's programs. This latter type of expenditure is often called indirect costs. There's a lot of fixation on terms and definitions. The fact is, though, and particularly for the purposes of the discussion today, focusing on non-program cost as something to be minimized is totally flawed, and it needs to stop. There's literally no data that links low overhead to better outcomes. And I think we're all gathered on this call and in the work that we do every day trying to get to good outcomes. So one of the things that makes my blood boil, there are a lot of things around this issue that make my blood boil, but one of them is that if you look at some of the rhetoric that I've often heard, well, nonprofits need to run lean, more like businesses. If only they ran more like businesses, we'd have a very different scenario. The fact is, if any organization, nonprofit or otherwise, to do good work needs to be focused on both efficiency and effectiveness. Overhead just doesn't get you to any sort of indicator of effectiveness. And we don't judge companies on their overhead. So what you see here is the basically overhead analog in the for-profit space. sales, general, and administrative expense as percentage of total sales. And you'll see here 4 major service industries. So this is aggregated data for companies over $10 million across these 4 industries. What you see is essentially an overhead rate at around 34%. So to me, the notion of nonprofits should run lean, and often the anchor number we've heard is 10%. The overhead should be kept at 10%. It is very much a weird myth on how we arrived at that number. So how does this play out for
nonprofits? Can I ask a quick question about that, Ann? On the sales piece on the last slide. So that includes what would, kind of the equivalency of fundraising costs would be kind of sales?
Exactly.
All right, thanks.
Exactly. So sales you could think of as fundraising, general and admin being management in general in nonprofit parlance, particularly if you're talking about the way that 990s are, the definitions go.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So how does this play out for nonprofits? Given that 80+% of you work for nonprofits, I suspect this won't be terribly surprising. Basically what you see is this dynamic where funders, institutional like philanthropy, the vast majority of philanthropic dollars are, 80% of them are program restricted and cap the amount that can go to overhead, as well as government grants where the number is even lower. We'll talk about that in a moment. And sometimes individual donors also often really strive to have all their money go towards program and to minimize the percent that goes to non-program costs. What happens if you are a nonprofit then is you feel an extreme pressure to conform. And this basically leads probably to underreporting, and we'll talk about some drivers of why that's the case in a moment, as well as underinvestment, going back to the right people on the bus slide and the importance of systems, infrastructure, finance, ops, HR, et cetera, in order to do really good work. So some of these dynamics that I've mentioned kind of add up to the nonprofit starvation cycle. And you'll see here it really shown as a cycle. You could imagine starting to break that cycle at any point, that because it is a cycle. We say, and I firmly believe, that starting with breaking some of the unrealistic funder expectations is a really powerful place to start, largely because of the power dynamic at play with funders having the money, by definition, in order to get the nonprofits to do their work. What I'm going to do for the next few moments is just step through some of the data that appears in the nonprofit starvation cycle and that we may reference throughout, and then I'll share a few glimmers of hope and some other ways that I think would be more productive and virtuous in order to get out of this cycle. So we'll start with the unrealistic expectations piece. Here we're looking at individual donors. And the fact that this is some Better Business Bureau Wise Giving Alliance research, it's an older study, although I suspect that these figures haven't changed considerably since it was done. Many individual donors actually consider overhead rate to be more important than programmatic effectiveness. And when I originally saw this, I thought, no, that just I can't really, seriously. This really is the data from a very large sample, that many of the respondents, 79%, said overhead was very important versus 70% saying success of programs.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. If you look at institutional philanthropy, as I mentioned a moment ago, about 80% of the dollars that flow from institutional philanthropy to nonprofits are restricted in nature. And the restrictions of that can be everything from no dollars can go towards overhead to 10, 20%. Sometimes the foundations can be flexible and work with nonprofit grant recipients and what that number is. The fact is 80% of the dollars flowing from philanthropy are restricted in nature. When you talk about unrealistic funder expectations, I find this statistic in particular quite surprising, that when you ask, and grant makers for effective organizations have done this, they've asked foundation leaders, does your grant cover the cost of reporting to you on that grant? And 80% of funders will say it does not include sufficient overhead to cover the cost of reporting. To me, there's something in this about funders actually realizing that there's some weirdness here in capping overhead, and actually that overhead just purely as needed to cover reporting costs is not being recouped. So government contracts and grants, for those of you who receive them, I'm sure this is, you probably are feeling this quite painfully, often are both restricted as well as diluted. And this is, I'll just give a quick example. This was from a Government Accountability Office report that is excellent on just overhead and indirect costs. You'll see the source below. They basically looked at an example. They looked at 8 states, I believe, and some of the flows of indirect dollars to the intended grant recipients. This is an example from Health and Human Services Safe and Healthy Families Grant Program at the federal level. It was the state of Maryland, who was the Department of Human Resources, was the recipient organization of those federal funds. And the state of Maryland then passed those funds along to the different counties. In this case, St. Mary's County Department of Social Services was the recipient county agency. St. Mary's County acts on behalf of the state, and between St. Mary's County and Maryland, they kept 10% for their own administrative costs because, of course, in order to administer the grants, they incur administrative costs. What this ultimately means then for, in this particular instance, the Board of Education, because this program was being implemented through schools and districts, they had no indirect cost funding to use in order to administer the grant. They then passed it on to nonprofit grant recipients, where similarly there was no indirect cost allowable. And what's really tough about this, and there are lots of ways this conversation could get political at a time where I don't think that's terribly productive. I think, though, that what's really tough about this is that when you look at a nonprofit grant recipient, many of them probably as a recipient of these types of funds, this program could have been absolutely core to the mission that they're trying to achieve. In order to administer that grant, however, they were going to have to go and scramble, per my earlier comment, to raise sufficient funds to cover the overhead associated with that particular grant. And for those of you who receive government funds, you will probably be able to attest that the reporting requirements on government funds can often be onerous. One of the clients that we work with, when we looked at, they basically were getting a 5 cents on the dollar reimbursement rate for their indirect costs on a government grant, and they were incurring 31 cents on the dollar in order to report back to the government on the use of those funds. I don't think that's it's a pretty large differential, although I think that it happens more than would be ideal. So unrealistic funder expectations basically takes you to a place where nonprofits feel significant pressure to conform, to limit their overhead. One of the best pieces of research done on the topic of nonprofit overhead costs was a 4-year study conducted between the Urban Institute and the University of Indiana Center on Philanthropy. Basically, they looked at thousands and thousands of nonprofits and talked to them, looked at their 990s, et cetera, to understand some of what was going on. Here you see where nonprofits feel the pressure to limit their overhead fundraising and admin. I suspect that in the wake of the GuideStar, Charity Navigator, and Better Business Bureau Wise Giving Alliance announcements denouncing overhead, some of the more individual donor charity watchdogs federated campaigns, that messaging, I hope, will begin to shift and feel much more constructive. The fact is, though, here foundations and government agencies are still huge drivers of that pressure to conform. So what happens then? Nonprofits often underreport their true overhead and or they underinvest in it. So here's a number for you, 37%. This is the percent of nonprofits reporting zero fundraising expenses on our IRS Form 990. And this is based on 220,000 990 forms. So this is not a small sample. And in fact, it was a very, very rigorously selected sample from the nonprofit overhead cost study. 37% reporting zero fundraising expense. Now, when I saw this data, thought there's got to be more to this. And since half of nonprofits in this country, I believe, are under around $100,000 in revenue, I thought, well, this might be a factor of that skewing where a lot of volunteers, for example, are doing the fundraising or board members. This number is almost exactly the same for organizations over $1 million and over $10 million in revenue. So the fact is here, and this is a quote from the overhead cost study, if you look at reported overhead, there's a pretty big discrepancy, I think, between what's actually happening on the ground and what's reported. I think it's super important to note that one of the big drivers of this is a lack of kind of standards for reporting. So I don't know how many of you have read the IRS Form 990 end-to-end. It's not terribly fun to read all the directions for it. in the wake of some changes a couple of years ago, some colleagues and I went back and looked, and the fact is there's not great definitions around how to treat marketing costs, for example, how to treat communications costs. And so the incentive then for nonprofits is to take the most best interpretation to minimize their numbers on their 990s. The other driver here is lack of infrastructure and systems. So one study conducted, I believe it was in 2003, so I'm hoping that this data is better now, but the study showed that only 33% of nonprofits had time tracking systems, and only 10% of nonprofits used a tracking system to track functional expenses, where they basically would be able to get a better sense of their full costs. So the irony here, right, is that those systems are called overhead, and overhead is hard to fund. But when you're not able to actually really isolate the different drivers of your costs, it can be really complicated for nonprofits to understand what is overhead, what is programmatic, et cetera. There's a fair amount of tacit support for misleading reporting by multiple players, and this I've covered at some length already, so I won't spend a lot of time there. And then finally, there's lack of consequences for misreporting. It's the 990 process. The 990 processing is fairly skinnily resourced, particularly in these more austere times. There just aren't consequences to really track down folks that have reported overhead. That seems like it's probably worth a conversation. So just a couple last comments. So a lot of this has been, as I said, the sinister naming, the starvation cycle of the overhead myth, and really just, gosh, this is pretty vicious. What do we know about some glimmers of hope? So, I mean, I think in a moment, Jacob will talk about this, I think, quite a bit more. But the announcement from GuideStar, Charity Navigator, and Better Business Bureau is, I think, a really, really big deal and a really big step to just changing how individual donors interact with and see some of, perceive overhead, and the extent to which, frankly, overhead is not a valid indicator of effectiveness. We're seeing some foundation and nonprofit kind of mixed company, is what I call it, efforts, one of them led by the Donors Forum in Illinois, which has brought together over a period of time both nonprofit leaders as well as philanthropic leaders to really wrestle with what's going on here. How do we, first of all, build some trust to have tough conversations about this, as well as really wrestle with, you know, how do you think about fully loaded costs to get to outcomes? How do we really work together to minimize the reporting burden but still focus on getting information about what's working for a given grantee, et cetera. And then beyond that, just an ongoing and really deep commitment on the part of a lot of organizations that work with both funders and nonprofits, grant makers for effective organizations on the philanthropy side, for example, National Council on Nonprofits on the nonprofit side, and many others who I think partly emboldened by this summer's announcement have really been pushing this in a much more intentional way out to their constituencies. So if we're going to move from vicious to virtuous, the first thing, and this may seem really simplistic, the questions that you ask matter. And I would put forth two. The first is, what do good outcomes really cost? And this is, I think, an issue of both skill building on the part of donors and nonprofits, as well as will building, a willingness to have different sorts of conversations. In a lot of the work that we do with nonprofit organizations, it quickly becomes clear how complicated it can be to understand the full cost of a program, particularly in a multi-program context. Creating the space and, frankly, having the resources ideally available from a funder to understand what's going on, what are the economics of programs, and how do you really fund good outcomes on a program-by-program basis is really critical, as are the conversations that then follow. And then secondly, and I think Jacob will talk, I suspect, about both of these a bit, I know certainly on the second, what are the meaningful measures of impact and how are we going to communicate them? So I go back to the first slide that I showed with some quotes from nonprofit promotional materials. I feel like there is a lot that nonprofits can do to communicate really about the outcomes that they're getting, the impact they're having in their community in ways that don't have to elevate the percent that goes to overhead. And this doesn't mean that an organization has a, gold standard RCT associated with it or anything like that. This is really about how does the nonprofit conceptualize and think about and communicate what it's doing for the people or the issue that it cares most about, and finding better ways to communicate that in the way that gets away from the pie chart with the skinny slice. So I'm going to stop there. I'm sure I will get a chance to weigh in later, but I'll stop there and turn it back over to Greg and then to Jacob.
Hey, Ann, thanks. That was fantastic. Just a couple of quick follow-up questions that we got along the way.
Sure.
One person in the audience suggested, wanted to get your comments on the observation that some private foundations, because they already kind of have their corpus of money, may have lower overhead costs because they're not actually raising money, and then maybe that misperception of kind of having all your resources on hand and just giving them away creates this, if our overhead is only X, then yours should be too. Do you think that is contributing to this in any way?
I don't know. I'm not sure. It is true that in the Form 990-PF, the private foundation form, foundations do have to report this as well. And I've just done kind of quick back-of-the-envelope pulling, I don't know, it was something like 20, 25 foundations to understand what they reported. And the numbers, frankly, aren't that different from the sample that I chose, which was admittedly not terribly scientific, than what gets reported by nonprofits. So I can imagine there's some bit of that going on. The interesting thing, of course, though, is that foundations' overhead isn't put under scrutiny. It might be by the public. It might be by trustees and other stakeholders. But so I'm not sure. But the rates that get reported, I don't think, are terribly different between foundations and nonprofits.
Well, thank you for commenting on that. Were there any other Sherrys that were just kind of observations or questions that were directly aimed at Ann?
I think a lot of these may be addressed by Jacob.
Yeah, a lot of the questions are like, well, what are the next steps, and how do we organize around, some different frameworks and perspectives. So I think that's a great start. We'll keep the questions coming in, and we're going to turn it over now. We're actually going to do a quick poll just to keep people engaged. The question will be, let's fire that one up. Sorry. So it's kind of a quick temperature, taking a temperature of the people that are listening right now. To what degree does your organization feel pressured to limit or underreport its overhead expenses? From not at all to yes, absolutely, it hurts. So we're taking a quick poll now. People are answering. Let's see what our initial response. Do people see these responses?
When I show them, they will.
Yeah. Yeah. No, we're getting about what you'd expect. An early lead for the number 4 position, somewhat short of it hurts, but definitely well more than not at all. So thank you. Why don't you post that up now? So clearly this is resonating with with the audience that is on the phone right now. So that's a great segue, I think, to you, Jacob, for further kind of context and framing, and then maybe some other examples of what the next steps are, particularly GuideStar's role in some of this as well. So you out there, Jacob?
I am ready.
All right.
So let me just start by affirming every word of what Ann just said. That we've found ourselves in a deeply problematic situation as a field, that we are systematically starving the very organizations that they're trying to make the world a better place, and we've created a system that is just reinforcing that. And I think it's worth pausing for a moment and asking why. How did we end up in this situation? And I actually think that it came from a good place, that the behaviors that led to this unfortunate situation had good intentions, and they come from what I like to call the 2 elephants in the philanthropic room. And these are the hard truths about the nonprofit sector that we all know are true, but we often don't admit in polite company. And the first one is just that some nonprofits are better than others. They create more impact than others, and donors are authentically trying to figure out who those are. And in the absence of something better and something easier, they've found themselves falling on this deeply problematic shortcut metric of the overhead ratio. And then second, that some donors are better than others. And frankly, a donor that is focusing intensely on the overhead ratio in the absence of attention to clarity, to results, to communication with stakeholders, they don't qualify as better. I'll put it that way. And so I want to argue that we need to build an alternative if we're going to address these elephants, and if we're going to move beyond the starvation cycle. We need to build an alternative. And so how do you build things? One of the first things you need is scaffolding. And I really like talking about scaffolding because scaffolding is a sign that humanity is trying to create something. And it's trying to do that collectively. That it needs to build some sort of a structure that enables it to act in effective ways. And scaffolding at its best can be quite beautiful. Here are photos of the Washington Monument about 13 years ago when it was renovated, and they picked a famous architect, Michael Graves, to design the scaffolding, and many people, myself included, thought it was more beautiful with the scaffolding than without. There's even a website, keepitcovered.com, that advocated for this scaffolding. But the beauty of scaffolding is not what's important. What's really important is what scaffolding enables us to do. And we can think about the scaffolding used by Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And it's time in the nonprofit sector that we built new information scaffolding that can help us move beyond these narrow conversations about overhead to something much richer that's really about social change. So let's think about some of the categories of information that are relevant for someone making a decision about social change. Not just a donor, but a journalist trying to figure out what organization to write about, or a government official trying to understand the landscape of potential allies, or an academic researcher trying to ask a question about what really works. So let me just offer these 4 categories of information that are relevant for us. So one is just the issue that we care about. There's social indicator data about the people in the communities and the ecosystems that we're trying to serve. That's relevant for making decisions about social change. Another kind of relevant information is information about interventions. What does the social science research actually tell us about what works to make the world a better place? Then a third category of information is the kind of information we focus on at GuideStar, which is information about nonprofits themselves. And the overhead ratio fits in this category. And then a fourth category is information about resources that are made available, that are directed to try and help us solve these problems. And that, for example, is the kind of information you'd find on Foundation Center. And as a field, we've kept these different types of information in these silos. We have not figured out how they interact with each other. And that, I think, has really led us to this overly simplistic focus on financial ratios. So when we think about different types of information that are available to help people make better decisions, we tend to think about highly quantitative structured information. But another thing I want to argue is that social change is really complicated, and there are many different kinds of information that can help us make good choices, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, whether it's about how we contributed to a solution or we were actually the ones responsible for it, whether it's subjective or objective, whether it's information that's really only relevant for your organization or your issue, or whether it's something that's comparative that can allow you to benchmark or compare yourself to others. And then finally, whether it's information about what you hope to have happen in the future versus what's happened in the past. And I want to argue that every single one of these different types of information is relevant for helping us make better decisions as social change actors. But that then leads us to the question of how do we as a field, or how have we organized information to help us make better decisions? And the truth is that we have focused on this. This is the Form 990. Anne's already talked about it. Most everyone on this call will know about it. It's the tax form that nonprofits fill out. It is a very important source of information on many levels. It's really helped to advance accountability and transparency in the sector in important ways. But we have to keep in mind that it's a tax form, and that it's only meant to be a tax form. And we as a sector have allowed a regulatory document to become the mechanism by which we tell our story to the world. And that is a recipe for exactly what we've gotten, which is this focus, as Ann discussed, on these cursed pie charts, on this narrow understanding of what social change is all about. Now, I should pause here and say that I do not believe that the overhead ratio is meaningless or useless. It is a tool for occasionally weeding out fraud or gross mismanagement.
Right.
There are cases of fraud in the field, and there are far too many of them. They are in the tiny minority, but that doesn't mean they don't matter, and we need to be willing to suss out those bad actors and get them out of the field so that those resources can go to those organizations that really are trying to do good in the world. But again, it is a filter for fraud. It is not a proxy for performance. And that's why my colleagues and I, Art Taylor at Better Business Bureau, Wise Giving Alliance, and Ken Berger at Charity Navigator, wrote and signed this letter to the donors of America, saying exactly that we need to move beyond this focus. This then leads us to the question of move beyond where? What's the alternative that we're going to build? And let me start by saying that we don't have the perfect answer yet as a field. I think we're going to have to develop this. But there are a lot of
the answer. It's clear. No, you've got all the answers. Don't. No.
Jacob, over to you for all the answers.
I appreciate your confidence, but we've got some work to do. But there's a lot we can build on. I just want to talk about some of these experiments that are happening and how they're beginning to be woven together in a way that I think will, in the next couple of years, really offer a meaningful alternative to overhead. So if you think in the private sector, there are many examples where in different ways people have tried to make sense of our complex world, where we've had similar situations where there were qualitative opinions or uncertain data, but people still needed to make choices. And these examples I have in the left column, they follow different ways of thinking. Sometimes it's really about experts, or sometimes it's about user reviews, sometimes basic standards or deep analysis. And the good news in the nonprofit sector is that all of these different approaches that people have experimented with in government, private sector for many years, now have parallels in the nonprofit sector. And I think it's really important that we have this variety of approaches because the nonprofit sector is really diverse. We cannot expect a local homeless shelter to use the exact same way of thinking to analyze its work that Greenpeace does or that the Brookings Institution does. And so we need a variety of approaches, but they need to ultimately be about performance. What I'm saying here is not that we want to let nonprofits off the hook. In fact, it's the opposite. I want to raise standards for nonprofits, hold organizations accountable, all of us, but do it on the right things. I'm not going to go through and talk about all these different examples, and some of them you're probably already familiar with, but there are these very real efforts to begin to offer alternatives. And one of them I will focus on, which is the Charting Impact Initiative, which is a very simple initiative created by GuideStar, Better Business Bureau, as well as our colleagues at Independent Sector, which is quite simply to clarify what are the 5 questions that every organization should answer. I have them here on the screen now. And this gets to something very important that Ann said, which is about clarity of communications. And I would argue, and I think many of our experience would bear this out, that clarity of one's strategy is a really important prerequisite for creating impact. You have to know what you're trying to accomplish in order to accomplish it. And we need some basic frameworks that are standardized that can help us reveal this, that can encourage this clarity, and then enable us to engage with it in a at least somewhat comparative and standardized way. And these sort of questions, I think, can be answered by every single nonprofit. There is no single quantitative metric that's relevant for every organization, but every organization should be able to answer these 5 questions. Big or small, advocacy or service, whatever it may be, everyone should be able to answer these questions. And I will note that these questions have become fully integrated into the GuideStar Exchange. And the GuideStar Exchange is something I'll talk about in just a moment. It's our mechanism for collecting data directly from nonprofits. So just 3 more slides, and then we'll hand it over to more questions. When we think about the nonprofit sector, it's a giant complex system. More than 20 million employees, more than 1 million organizations, more than 80,000 foundations. And we have to think about how do you actually get information from one part of that system to another. And for a long time, it looked essentially like this. It was a supply chain where information moved from the left to the right through the Form 990. And that has formed a very important baseline for all of us. But lately, things have gotten a whole lot more complicated. So this right here is a network diagram of 171 different online giving and nonprofit information sites of various kinds. And you'll see that they're connected to each other in interesting ways. They're sharing information, or they have co-branding or other kinds of partnerships. You can see GuideStar's there in the middle, and Social Actions over on the left side that has the most connections is a project of GuideStar. But we've moved to this networked world where information is flowing around in lots of different directions, and that offers great potential if we can organize it, but it also makes things kind of confusing. And that's why, to move on to my final slide, we've moved to a scenario more like this. And there are just a couple things I want to mention here. So you see on the left-hand side, under the sources column, that there are many different people or institutions that have good information about nonprofits. Many different kinds of information, not just financial, but programmatic or perceptual data. And then you have all these different players that are aggregating different pieces of that information and then bringing it together into GuideStar. I will say that going forward, the single most important source of data about nonprofits is going to be nonprofits themselves. And I think that will always be true. But we need to allow nonprofits to answer questions that are relevant to social change and not just relevant to their taxes. And that's what the GuideStar Exchange program is about. And 95,000 nonprofits so far have provided us at least some data, with about 43,000 reaching at least what we call our bronze level of participation. And down the road, the most important thing that nonprofits, I will argue, will be able to do to tell their story in a rich way that captures the power and interconnection of the internet across all these different platforms is to make sure that their GuideStar Exchange profile is updated, because that will be the core common profile of the nonprofit sector. Now, it's worth then talking a little bit about what we have on the right-hand side, which is that even if GuideStar is big, we're still tiny compared to the internet. I like to tell a story about how I was having brunch with a friend at Google and proudly said we had 3 million users every year. And my friend at Google said we have 3 million users every minute. And
those Googlers.
I know.
Always putting us in our place.
And so, you know, we have to be humble in the face of the giant machine that is the internet, 600 million different websites in the world. And so what's really important is organizing the information, not so it shows up on GuideStar, but so that it shows up on lots of other platforms. And so there are about 60 platforms that we're sharing data with right now. And so down the road, I believe that as we begin to aggregate these many different kinds of information, these different ways of understanding nonprofit performance, we can really capture the power of the internet as an information distribution system. We're really thoughtful about how we visualize this information so it can be intelligible to users. I believe that we can offer a meaningful alternative to the overhead myth, and thus that we can break the nonprofit starvation cycle.
Jacob, that's fantastic, and I will speak from my own experience, and really a shout out to the GuideStar Exchange program. I know that for many years GuideStar has kind of urged the sector to take responsibility for telling its own story and coming and making that real. And I will say that GuideStar, I think, at this point now under your leadership has really transformed from the urging posture to the invitation posture. And I know our CFO went online maybe 2 months ago, discovered that VolunteerMatch was only a silver, a silver participant in the program, and leaned over and just said, "Hey, we need to be gold on GuideStar," and went off and answered the questions. And I think it was just remarkable to me that after 12 years of like, we probably should have been doing this, it just took a different frame of reference to make that change. So other organizations out there, I do think that it's good for your organization to go through the exercise necessary, and also probably the single most important first step in helping reframe the overall conversation from one of just tax information to all of us as nonprofits being able to tell our story and frame it up not as the inputs, but really as the impact we all are making. But along those lines, I feel one of the biggest questions that I often hear in this space, and maybe Ann and Jacob, you can comment on this. I've seen over the years a great deal of hand-wringing that VolunteerMatch, or as an organization or any nonprofit, does not have a single unit of analysis like the for-profit sector does. Shareholder return in the quarter, or annual profits, and until we can find one uniform measure of success, one yardstick that we can measure all nonprofits by, nothing will ever change. What's your feeling? How do you respond to that critique?
So I'll go ahead and start. I'm sure Jacob has thoughts as well. So I do think that, first of all, I would honor that hand-wringing concern. I think it's very, very real. So when I started earlier saying, the for-profit sector doesn't focus on overhead, well, the reason partly is that they have some measures that do span that whole sector. That is not true in the nonprofit sector. So I honor that concern. I also feel, I would say a couple things. The first is that, particularly in the direct service space, there has been some excellent, excellent work done over the last decade or so by folks like Urban Institute, as well as the folks behind the site performwell.org. It's escaping me who is there's a set of organizations behind them, but that basically look at common indicators for juvenile justice outcomes, child welfare outcomes, et cetera. So I still would say each nonprofit probably has unique, nuanced things that it might be trying to do as part of its own mission that may or may not fit perfectly with that. But I do feel like, as compared to 10 years ago or so, there's been some real focus on, if we had common indicators by subfield, by subsector, what might those be and how might you measure them in a way that we didn't have before. But then the other thing I would say is, while the hand-wringing is merited, just going back to the points that both Jacob and I had made, and that you just underscored with your anecdote about VolunteerMatch on the GuideStar Exchange, that a lot of this does come down to communication. That I think there's a lot of control that nonprofit organizations have ceded but can take back on answering those questions that Jacob showed. That just really say, this is who we are. This is how we measure our impact. This is what we believe you get when you invest in us and what our beneficiaries get. People should make informed choices about whether or not that's the right place to be giving.
Jacob, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I also would honor that impulse, but I also would, ask that we step back and just consider the immense diversity of the nonprofit sector in both form and purpose. That organizations are trying to accomplish very different things in very different ways, and that given that diversity, I just don't think we can expect one single metric. What we can expect, though, is, to oversimplify, one single format, that we can begin to present these very different stories and different purposes and different approaches in familiar ways. And I think about a nutrition label on packaged food, and people are looking for different things on a nutrition label. You have very different kinds of food. Different things are measured depending on the food, but the format is consistent and allows people to engage with that information in a pretty stable way. And so my hope is that by over time offering a format that's consistent, we can get away from the belief that there's any one single metric that can really tell the story of such a diverse field.
So I'm sure everyone will, in the next month or so, we'll definitely have, we'll get a grant. We'll have an opportunity to apply for a grant. The dreaded overhead allowance of somewhere between 10 and 13% will be clearly explained to the recipient. What do we do? I mean, do we go on strike? Do we send it back, return to sender, no thanks, we're not taking your stinking money?
Yeah.
Like at a practical level, what do you do when we get the next, invitation to apply for a grant and we can see, ahead of time that it's going to have these restrictions on it? What is the most appropriate response? Can you write a letter for us? Dear funder,
yeah.
Greg will not be responding to your kind invitation because he does not believe that you are satisfying his need for a larger infrastructure allowance.
Right. And we've actually been trying to figure out if we could write a similar sort of funder-oriented letter to the individual donor-oriented letter we've already done, and we may do that. I mean, there are several things. I mean, one is that we're stuck with the current situation, and we have to chip away at it. We can't expect it to immediately transform, but I think we can chip away at it. The three of us, GuideStar, Better Business Bureau, and Charity Navigator, intentionally put that letter under Creative Commons license so that any nonprofit can reuse it anytime without our permission. You don't have to ask, just do it however makes sense for you. So that's one tool that's available. For funders, for institutional funders that one hopes are more sophisticated, I would think that that we can, as a field, begin to go back to them with data and just say, here is why the cap that you have really doesn't work for us, and here is why the investments we're making in our core functions are so essential to us achieving the outcomes that you care about. And I think that most smart funders are going to get that. And that may not be everybody, so there's some risk there, I know. But I think that funders are going to be open to honest conversations about this if we can bring some data and some clarity to those conversations.
Yeah, I just add a couple of quick points. One is that so there's an element of kind of reading the context, right? So for any organization that's really concerned about that very low cap that you gave as your example, Greg, you can imagine, if it's a really close-in funder with whom there's been a funding grantee relationship for some time, you could imagine a conversation between those two organizations. I think it would be hard, but I also think it's possible. It's really at the judgment of the nonprofit leaders themselves on whether or not that's too risky of a move. But over the last few years, I've heard countless stories of organizations doing things like not saying thanks but no thanks, although I have heard those stories actually, and I'll make a comment about that in a minute. But to actually say, thank you so much for this opportunity. Just wanted to let you know we will honor the terms of your grant, for example. But the real fully loaded cost of delivering this particular program is X. And just to use basically as an awareness building opportunity is one thing. Again, I think a lot of it has to do with the trust between the grant maker and the donor, or the grant maker and the grantee. The other thing is that 10 to 13% is pretty much too low for any organization. There is though, when you think about like whether or not to take a grant, there's a question of, well, okay, but what is the fully loaded cost of doing this? What are we going to have to subsidize here? What are we going to have to raise? And it's been my experience that a lot of nonprofits, per my earlier comment, struggle with understanding their full cost for a particular program or intervention. I think that's the skill building piece of it. There are some, I think, very strong tools out there, strong technical assistance programs to help really get at the heart of that. So that way, if you're going to take on a grant where you may have to take a loss, because things don't change overnight, for Jacob's point, at least you know at what level you're having to subsidize it. Or again, if you're going to have a conversation with the donor, you're able to really be clear about what your full costs are.
Right. I mean, I think that's, knowledge is a big piece of it. I think when we've been most successful as an organization, it's been when we've been able to frame up, the overall deliverables that we want to be able to drive at, and then resources required to get there. And when we've been able to frame up our philanthropy activity in that context, we've been very successful. And at other times, we've also, like any other organization, I think, fallen to being viewed just kind of as a vendor that's delivering on some function for a foundation or some other grant maker. Right. And in those instances, I feel like that dynamic is very different, and you become, you really become beholden to their interests and their framework. I'm wondering, what's your view? Do we have to organize ourselves as a political lobby and change the 990? I mean, do we need to just reframe that tool so that we don't, should we be marching to Congress?
I don't think so, because the 990 is a tax form, and we need that to play its role as a tax form, and we can try to add additional information to that, and we might be able to succeed. Although that could backfire, and we've seen the ways that that government can struggle to help to organize this sort of information.
Right.
But at the same time, is that their job, or is that our job as a field?
Right.
And so, my hope is that we as a field can step up, whether that's infrastructure organizations like VolunteerMatch and GuideStar and Bridgespan and Foundation Center and others, to make that as easy as possible for nonprofits, and to do it on our terms, but to ensure that our terms are not just we want to get off easily. Our terms are actually that we want to really hold ourselves accountable to what really matters.
Agreed. Well, we've only got a few minutes left, so I wanted to give an opportunity for any other questions. I know that a lot of questions have come through, and we've tried to do our best to translate them back to our speakers. And I think maybe with a few minutes left, I'd just like to ask, are there specific resources, next steps, or advice that you'd like to share with folks on the line for them to take this back into their workplaces and take the next step? Maybe I'll start and just reinforce. We went through the GuideStar Exchange, and I really felt great about participating in that effort. And I think it was more than just the individual benefit to our organization. I do think that it's something that the more organizations do that and participate in that program, the better information will be out there, and we can help change some of the larger narratives, so that when press people and others who are commenting on the space, are lamenting that there aren't enough measures of success beyond, the overhead myth, that we do have something to point to as a sector and not just as a handful of individual organizations. So maybe I've taken your bullet line, Jacob, to come up with something else. So maybe, Anne, do you have other advice for folks on the call?
Yeah, I do actually think that taking control over one's own communication platform and representing per the GuideStar Exchange, I think is super powerful. The other is kind of to your point about collective action. I mean, there's part of it where you say, gosh, like any individual actor is not, especially on the nonprofit side, the incentives are not aligned. For VolunteerMatch to grab the microphone and say, "This, I'm done with it. I'm not going to stand for it anymore." Anyone? Because you risk your. I mean, maybe you'll do that. We should talk later, but I think that's really tricky. There are, however, organizations that are really, I think, putting this at the forefront at the moment that are aggregators and try to a diverse sector's voice, like National Council on Nonprofits and some of the funder aggregators as well. And I would say for those who are members of those organizations, just to be willing to just send a quick note to folks that there, to the leaders there, to say how much you believe we need to take steps on this, because it just adds your voice to it. It gives them some concrete, this is a story from the field, and there's already a lot of momentum, but it will put some wind in the sails.
Thank you. Jacob, final thoughts?
Yeah, final quick thoughts. So one is, I hope that people just experiment with using the letter that we put together and just share it with your board, share it with your donors, get feedback from them, see if that resonates. And if not, contact us directly. I mean, my Twitter handle is right there on the screen. Please feel free to reach out and give us your suggestions. We'd really welcome them. We want to help the sector as much as we can on this.
That's great. Well, I want to thank Shari for organizing this, thank Anne and Jacob for participating in this great conversation and the leadership that you are demonstrating in the field. And I want to thank all of the people who have joined us today and taken time out of their busy schedule to be a part of this. We very much appreciate you joining.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And I want to reiterate, I know that a lot of you had really wonderful questions that we didn't necessarily address directly, but if we've learned anything today, it's that the most important thing is to continue talking about this issue and communicating with each other and communicating with funders and donors. So don't stop. Pose your question to someone else, or ask online or ask at an event, and keep the conversation going. As a reminder, we will be sending everyone a follow-up email within the next few days with links to the full recording and the slide deck, so don't worry about that. And I just want to make a quick plug for next month's webinar. On November 20th, we're going to be joined by Idealware about integrating volunteers and volunteer management into donor management software. So that should be a really meaty one. So once again, thank you so much to Jacob, Ann, and Greg. This was really amazing, and I can't wait to see what comes out of it. Thanks, everyone, for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Signing off.